Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is James Arnett. I'm a partner at Capco, a management consultancy across the globe in all financial districts that focuses on just financial services and technology. Thank you for joining our latest webinar on operational resilience. I'm going to do a short introduction to today's panel, and then hand you over to the panel lead. Today we have Will Packard, who leads our operational resilience practice. His interest in operational resilience started when he was an army officer some 25 years ago. We have Rogan, who leads the operational resilience at UK Finance, the UK's banking trade body. Prior to this, he was the head of capital market infrastructure in the wholesale unit. We have Lucinda Zebrat, Executive Director and our Operational Resilience Campaign Manager. Lucinda's speciality is delivering large, complex change programs across business and technology. And we have Mark Schofield, founder and CEO of Mind Alpha, a behavioral science and scenario planning consultancy. In former life, he was the global head of macro research at Citibank. It gives me great pleasure to hand over to our moderator today, Will Packard.
Thank you, James. I'd like to kind of echo the welcome to all those who've dialed in. We see operational resilience in the kind of broadest terms. And certainly broader than just the incoming UK regulation. And we find it helps to split it down into three phases. The first phase is we see is around the preparation. And we see that the UK regulations that are a very good logical approach to making firms and moving firms towards increased resilience. And so that is one element. The next phase is around how you manage a disruptive event once it's actually happened. And while typically this has been a BCP activity in the past, we see for firms to be properly operationally resilient, they need to look at this pretty much together to ensure that once an event happens, that they can respond and use all the preparations that have been made in the previous phase. The last phase is around learning lessons or identifying and applying lessons from organizations globally and really ensuring that operational resilience remains current in terms of the changing nature of a threat, what's being learned about what's happened to other organizations, and also around what's happened to the firm, because firms have change projects that often impact the delivery of services. And so just looking at things on a kind of a one-off big bang approach, implementing the regulation and then annual thereafter, we don't feel is really sufficient to ensuring that firms are in the best possible position. Okay, so we had one of the questions when you all registered was around the element of the UK regulators' approach that was causing the most discussion around the firm. Now, these are the responses, and looking through them, they're more or less in the order that the regulators have said they need to be done. You flip scenario testing and self-assessment at the bottom and remove none of the above. It's pretty much in that order. And this very much mirrors when we're talking to firms, the stage that they're at. And so it's interesting. Most people are at the stage of really piloting the definition of and identifying important business services. And so these are topics that we're going to cover, along with impact tolerances and a little bit on scenario testing. We feel the vulnerability remediation is one that it's a little bit of it's a known unknown, in as much as until the important business services have been identified, it's almost impossible then to work out what is required to remediate vulnerabilities. Okay, so we put on the screen, we put up the 7 phases or the 7 elements of the UK regulators' approach. And this is just, we're not going to talk through them. This is just to allow us to refer to them when we go through the questions. So, Rogan, the consultation papers define the approach in quite a bit of detail, but leave many of the elements up to firms. Do you feel this is deliberate?
Look, thanks very much for the question, Will, and good afternoon, everyone. The quick and easy answer to that is yes. And the reason that we know that the answer to that is yes is that very senior people at both the Bank of England and the FTA have made quite clear that from their perspective, operational resilience is an outcome. How firms reach that, how firms become more resilient, more robust, safer, and generally better citizens of their entire financial sector, they're leaving up to them. What you've seen on the previous slide with respect to the poll is the structure, the framework in which firms are being asked to develop and design their own resilience frameworks. But ultimately, and that's obviously been set by the authorities, both in their consultation paper that came out in December, but also the discussion paper way back in 2018. But ultimately, the authorities have been quite clear that this is an area where they're really leaving up to individual firms to decide how they reach this outcome rather than being prescriptive. There's a couple of reasons for this. Obviously, in the UK, we are an outcomes-based regulator, and while the reality doesn't always match the ideal, because in this particular area, the UK authorities have been market leading, I suppose, and getting ahead of other jurisdictions, and have been talking about this now for some time. There's a bit of clear air here, both in the international context and the domestics, bring together all those constituent pieces that they've been talking to for time under this relatively new umbrella of operational resilience. So what we're seeing here is the authorities almost trusting in a way that individual firms of all types, retail, wholesale, and otherwise, are being given the tools, or at least being set the expectation, and then given the tools to design more effective and more resilient organizations, yet at the same time just being allowed that level of flexibility that they need to reach it in whichever way is appropriate for their firm, their customers, and their people.
Okay. And I mean, do you have an idea of, what what good looks like to the regulators?
Well, that's a really good question, actually. What does good look to the regulators? Ultimately, it comes down to, well, there's some expectations here that the regulators want. There's some outcomes that they want. Yes, they want a more resilient system. Yes, they want a more robust system. But at the very top, what they want to do is firms to start taking resilience much more seriously than they have in the past. And by seriously, we're talking about firms and boards factoring in decisions pertaining to resilience into their investment decisions. We've all heard the stories over the years that somewhere in some distant corner of a trading floor, there is a 25-year-old computer with Windows XP humming away in the background, whose sole purpose is to do some very specific but incredibly important calculation, and no one's game to shut it down and update it because it's just so critical to the functions and processes that are there. What the regulators want is for firms to get away from this approach that if it isn't broke now, don't fix it, but instead putting resilience up there with return on investment, return on equity, those kind of decisions right at the heart of boards when making those investment and choices and setting budgets going into the future. I think personally, and in discussion with the authorities, good for them will look like a firm that has got a very good understanding and awareness of their customers' needs, a very good understanding of what their important business services are, a very good understanding of just how long they can live with an outage in that particular space, and everyone from the most junior intern right to the top of the head of the board really bought into that process and understanding what it is exactly that the firm is trying to achieve and why they're taking the decisions that they're taking.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think that's a really kind of useful pointer, particularly with a effectively approach-based regulation than output-based regulation. Just one thing I should have mentioned right at the beginning. If you'd like to ask questions, if you want to just type it into the event chat in the bottom right of your screens, I'm going to be scanning this. There's going to be Q&A at the end, but if the question is relevant, then we'll add it to the we'll add it to the we'll cover it as we go along. So, Lucinda, in many ways the regulation signal a shift to what's gone before in terms of their regulations around kind of BCP, that cyber, etc. What do you think of which of the steps really are the ones that are driving this?
Hi, Will, and hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'd say there's two elements to consider here. I think firstly, regulations require the definition of impact tolerances in terms of the harm to clients. And this is something new. Typically, firms are looking about providing services that are important to the bank. And the twist here is that it's looking at in terms of the harm to clients. And that requires devising a metric to be able to do that. Typically, in terms of recovery time objectives in the IT departments, they're set and prioritized by the value of the customer to the firm. So in that case, a big hedge fund will get higher priority than a small group of mortgage holders. But when we talk about resilience, because the mortgage holders might actually be the recipients of higher harm as clients, the consultation paper signals that becomes a bit more of a priority. And secondly, something that Rogan's already alluded to, which is the board. Operational resilience will require board level sign off in terms of their compliance with the regulation. And with the advent of the senior managers regime, there is a high level of proof that's required because those board members retain personal liability. So what mechanisms will firms take to provide that proof? Our recommendation is that firms involve their boards very early on in the process to take them on the journey. So from the beginning of the steps that you see on the screen in terms of identification of those important business services, make sure the board agrees, yes, those are the services. Then as you progress through the steps, impact tolerances, vulnerabilities, etc., making sure that the boards really understand each step of the way will get you to a better result in the end when the board members actually then need to sign this off.
Yeah, and I think that is something that firms frequently underestimate, just the length of time, the number of iterations that will take. We've got our first question, and I'm going to direct it to Rogan. What level of standardization do you think will evolve out of the industry collaboration?
Well, it's a good question. I think there will be a lot of convergence with respect to a number of areas. However, I think there will definitely be a limit to that, so to speak. There's a lot of emphasis being put on through entities like the Cross Markets Operational Resilience Group, which is a private and public partnership chaired by the Bank of England and UK Finance, to look at systemic threats and issues to operational resilience on a holistic basis. Some good work's been done on that particular forum, such as the development of various pieces of guidance and around scenario testing and whatnot. But the approach that's come out of the result of those particular processes and that collaboration has been general agreement on underlying principles as to how firms can really look at these issues and the factors and principles that they should consider. I don't think we're going to get to, and nor should we want to, get to a point where we're all working to the same checklist at the same templates. What we should be doing, however, is aligning our thinking around things like what's the definition of customer harm, or what do we think intolerable harm looks like? Impact tolerances, what does that look like? And I know we'll be talking about that a bit later on as well. How do we engage with critical market infrastructures, and what information do we need from them to make good decisions? But there's other areas as well where actually it really depends on the individual. Management information being put up to the board as Lucinda, it's going to be absolutely critical, but only you know what your board is like, the individual personalities involved, what they want to hear and what they don't hear. So I think we'll see a convergence in thinking, which is part of the reason for the consultation paper and the discussion paper in the first place, and a general awareness and understanding across a number of areas as to how we can reach some issues. But the way that the authorities have gone around the CPs and the proposals is that it does give firms enough flexibility to really create bespoke solutions to their entities. And for those who haven't yet done those kind of thinking, firms like yourselves, Capco, can assist in helping answer those questions as to how do we become more resilient and how do we walk down this path.
We asked The second registration question we asked was around how well equipped are executives in decision making in a crisis. And this is an area that is of reasonable interest to us, because we think that if you ask a manager, are you good in responding to a crisis? Rather like asking someone, are you an above average driver? 90% of people say, yes, I'm an above average driver, and we think it's the same. And like any other area of human activity, you can improve on it. Some people will be naturally good at it, but for the most, it is a skill that that can be improved upon. So, Mark, if we assume a disruptive event has occurred, how can executives change tack quickly to kind of get themselves into the right frame?
Yeah, well, going back to the framework you showed at the beginning of sort of prepare, manage, and learn, the key part of that in the operational resilience and decision-making context is that prepare piece. And people tend to say, well, you can't prepare for unexpected event, but you can. It's about building robust processes, decision processes. When we're in a crisis situation, the two biggest enemies of rational decision-making are uncertainty and information overload. Uncertainty speaks for itself. You get a crisis or a disruptive event because you've got an unexpected outcome to an event. So there's bound to be uncertainty. But people underestimate the importance of information overload. You can define that as the amount of information that you can process in the time you have available to do that. And with a disruptive event or a crisis situation, that the time frame for making decisions is contracted. And that forces us into a pressurized situation, and it causes stress. And what happens then is that our brains step in and they introduce what in behavioral science we call heuristics, which are shortcuts or little tricks and rules of thumb to help us make decisions quickly under pressure. And two of the most common of those are simplification of the question, which very often causes us to oversimplify. So we end up answering not the question we need to answer, but a similar, perhaps related question, but one that's much easier to answer, and it doesn't always get to the nub of the problem. The other heuristic that we use is pattern recognition. So we seek back into our memory for patterns, for familiar sequences of events against which we can benchmark the situation. Now, when you've got recurring, consistent patterns, that's fine. It's a very effective way of making decisions without too much effort, too much cognitive effort. But when the situation is changing, it can be disastrous. So for executives, for leaders in a crisis situation, the answer is about having robust processes in place up front. The first thing is around the choice architecture. So it's creating a set of processes with which we gather information, making sure we're bringing in all the information we need from all the sources that we can, how we structure that information, how we analyze that information, and then how we make a decision on the back of it. And making sure that everybody in an organization or in a crisis response management team is familiar with and practiced in that process allows us to go through those steps and ensure that everything gets picked up. The second is something that you touched on earlier on in that requirement list. And I was a little surprised to see it quite low down the list. That was scenario testing or scenario planning. It's absolutely critical, because what scenario planning does, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit more later on, but it takes you out of the realms of the current base case situation, and it allows you to think about potential disruptive situations ahead of time. And what that's doing is it's creating new patterns in your mind. So when you get into a situation, there is some familiarity there. You've looked at something and said, this is not something I think necessarily is going to happen, but it's something that could happen. So it becomes familiar. And in pressurized decision making, you're able to then to use those pre-existing patterns in your mind to create a better sequence of decisions. I think, in terms of very specific actions you can take, I mean, the two best pieces of advice that I've ever heard, really, both incredibly simple. One is, don't ever start with a hypothesis. If you start with a hypothesis, you've got a preconceived idea of where you're heading. Start with the data, start with gathering the facts, and then allow that to shape your hypothesis. And the second one, Will, is something that you're probably familiar with from your military days. Don't let perfect be the enemy of very good. There's a tendency to try and find the perfect answer and solution, but in a disruptive or a crisis situation, things are changing all the time. So it's really important to make robust and good decisions, but to allow those to evolve. And going back to your framework, learning as you go along.
Mark, thanks for that. That I think that's a very useful. There's some kind of very useful topics you covered there, and I think that it's something that practice is, I imagine, absolutely vital to actually be able to do that when things are there's a lot of pressure around, and maybe unlike COVID where everyone's in the same boat, you're the number 3 story on the or your firm's disruption is the number 3 story on the BBC News website. I'd like to go back to looking at the regulation, looking at the steps in the consultation papers. Lucinda, what are the main drivers around identifying important business services?
So important business services need to be looked at under 3 lenses under the regulation. One is the harm to the customers, which I alluded to earlier. Second is financial stability. And the third is firm soundness. Now, realistically, in the event of a disruption, harm to customer is going to be the main driver for how the firm responds to be resilient. And in order to identify those important business services appropriately, firms are going to have a really solid understanding of their customers, good segmentation, and know what those customers use those services for. Firms will then need to outline all of the services offered, identify which of those services are used by each of those client segments, and the service will not be binary, right? You'll end up with a series of services you offer, but only a subset will be important. And I think once you get to that stage where you understand which is that subset that are important, and understand that harm to the customer lens, that's going to be the driver that firms need to focus on.
I think that's absolutely spot on, and I think it's really that understanding of the second order effects of the disruption, which is a combination of the customers and what the services are used for is absolutely vital in being able to rank those services. Moving on to impact tolerances. Rogan, what makes setting impact tolerances such a challenge to firms?
Well, I think it builds on Lucinda's answer to the earlier question. Look, impact tolerances is without question probably the most, probably the area that we found in terms of engaging with our membership that people are struggling with the most. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First one, it's a new concept. It's a new word. It's a new way of thinking. And given what we've spoken about earlier about the need to get boards really involved at an early stage, literally sitting down and briefing to your board what an impact tolerances is has proven quite challenging for a number of members. The second reason why it is proving so challenging is that it sort of looks like some pre-existing concepts and ideas and things that are already out there. And so a number of firms have fallen into the trap of just assuming that this is return time obligations by another name. This is risk appetite by another name. And when they're feeding this into the boards, if they themselves as executives don't have a really good understanding of what this is or what this is not, okay, then they're unfortunately reinforcing some of those pre-existing prejudices with senior decision making. Impact tolerances is new. It's a completely new concept. It doesn't really exist anywhere else outside of the UK, but it exists in partnership and alongside other things like RTO, which is a very American-driven, IT-driven, systems-driven concept. It will exist outside of risk appetite, which a lot of boards are actually much more comfortable with and aware of. Okay, it really is something new that's something come out. What also makes it very different, actually, and why it sits aside from RTOs and risk appetite, is that impact tolerances puts the customer at the very center. In order to understand your impact tolerances, in order to set your impact tolerances, you need to understand the level of importance that your customer or client places on the services that you provide. And unfortunately, and this leads to the fourth and final point, the reason why so many firms are struggling with impact tolerances is they don't necessarily have a good understanding of the customer. They might understand what the customer means to them as a firm. So a hedge fund, a pension fund, a brokerage might be responsible for a certain percentage of revenue or a certain amount of revenue, which is either very important or not very important. But you've got to put yourself in the customer's shoes. Okay, if I, as a firm, do 80% of clearing for a particular customer, then clearing an outage could be massively disruptive. Equally, if the customer is only worth 2% of the revenue from them, maybe under the pre-existing and formal regime, I wouldn't necessarily put a great deal of stock in meeting that customer's needs during an operational incident. So to summarize quite quickly, Will, the reason that so many people are struggling with impact tolerances is A, that it is actually new, B, that people are making the mistake of, or some people are making the mistake of equating it with pre-existing concepts like RTOs and risk appetite. And third, it's really because it's about the customer, and not every firm out there has a really good understanding of the way, of the level of, I suppose, reliance that customers are placing on their services.
And I think that's that knowledge of the client or the customer is just absolutely critical. And I think it's, the challenge, as you pointed out, that firms, I think, probably assume they know more about their customers than they actually do in terms of how the end use of the services. How can firms validate that they've actually got it right, that they've set their impact tolerances at the right level?
Look, how can they validate it? Look, the very first point is to actually, it almost comes back to that initial poll that you did. The first thing is really understanding what your important business services are. And a very distinct change between the 2018 discussion paper and the consultation papers that we saw last December, is that actually the authorities clarified that important business services is what exists between the point of contact between you and the customer. What exactly the customer relies on from you in order to conduct its own business, in order to, in some instances, survive or to access the market. So in order to get your head around impact tolerances, the first thing is to really understand, look, what is it that we actually do here? I have briefed boards, I'm sure many of us here as well, and had discussions with them. And in one particular education session, we did an exercise where we asked boards and said, right, if you were to say, what are the 5 most important things that we do here, what would they be? And they listed 5 things. Then we asked the question, okay, what do you think your customer? If you were to ask your customer that question, what are the 5 most important things I rely on my firm for? Okay, would they line up? Would they be cognizant? Would they be coherent? And what we've actually found as we've done these exercises initially is that boards are often focused on things like recovery and resolution, revenue streams, shareholder value, regulatory reporting. You put yourself in the mind of the customer, and often those things are well beyond their purview of their interest. They're interested in your payment system. I want to make sure that I can make my margin payments on time. I want to make sure that I can meet my mortgage payments. those sort of things as well. So the first step is really to understand the customer, understand what's important to the customer, have those conversations, okay, and then make judgments from there. The third thing with impact tolerances, and this will segue quite nicely to what's happened later, and it's also what Mark said a bit earlier, is about testing them. It's about scenario testing. And scenario testing involves two things. One is actually designing scenarios that really do test those tolerances, that really do mean something for your customers, that really do hit the sweet spot of, look, what is that important business scenario? And the second is actually carrying it out. I've come across a lot of firms, UK finance members and otherwise, that have fantastic pieces of paper that talk about exercises and gold teams and silver teams and crisis management and whatnot. And when you sit down with them and you say, look, how much muscle memory, how often have you exercised this function? The answer is actually much more sparse than you'd otherwise think of. And of course, in our sector, there's a lot of churn. You'll get someone up to speed, they'll become quite aware of the scenarios, what it means, their impact tolerances, and then they'll move on. And the firms ultimately may only revisit this once every 2 years. So there's a number of ways that people can actually revisit. And I see Mark nodding in the background there as well. We all, you never exercise like the first time you do exercise. We're all into it. It looks fantastic. We've got the bells and whistles and we're all sitting down. 2 years later, those same people are doing it. It often seems a bit of a hassle. This really needs to be at the center of people's job descriptions these days.
Yeah, and and I think that rehearsal very much, again, chimes with my experience in the army. I mean, one of the sayings that was bandied around frequently was a quote from Alexander Suvorov, a 19th century Russian general: "Train hard, fight easy." And I think that's something that is that could be applied here. And carrying on with scenario testing, we've heard from several firms that they're thinking about it now, and that it's leading to a little bit of head scratching. Why do you think they're finding it concerning, Lucinda?
It's a really good question, Will. I think they're finding it concerning because it's important and it's hard to do. So what Rogan was alluding to in terms of, needing to find the right scenarios to define and then to actually carry it out. So the scenario testing at the end of the life cycle of preparing for operational resilience is really the QA to make sure that vulnerabilities have been addressed. And the board will rely on this before accepting that the firm is operational resilient. And it's an iterative process. You'll have to run the test. If you have failures, there are any gaps, then firms will then need to invest time and money to resolve those, such that failure then does not occur. And running through those test scenarios can be a very difficult, labor-intensive process in the way that current financial services firms are set up right now. We talked to one client who actually mentioned that they basically had to secure a group of their subject matter experts in that particular life cycle of the process that they were testing. And it took them several hours to walk through what would happen from a systematic perspective to see if they had the right assurances in place to make sure that they would not exceed their impact tolerances. A good example of scenario testing that you could use in the current state is the coronavirus scenario, right, where there are periods of lockdown and sometimes people cannot leave their homes. What if one of your important business services is not something that you can provide remotely to your customers? Then that's a very good example of a gap that requires remediation. And we all know how financial services firms' budget cycles work. Their change life cycles are quite extensive in some cases. And I think that, scenario testing is hugely important because it gets them through the cycle of, yes, we are now finally resilient, and we can then take that to our board and get them to sign that off.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely that's absolutely right. And I know firms have been. I mean, it's interesting in the regulation that the regulators have stated that they're not just interested in scenarios firms pass, but also the ones that they fail, as a way of calibrating their level of operational resilience. And again, that's going to be, I think, quite a difficult concept for firms to digest, that they're supposed to test scenarios where they fail and then confess that to the regulators, which is a mindset that is, I think, pretty unheard of these days. Rogan, do you think the regulations are going to, and talking about the regulations, do you think the regulations are going to differ very much from what's in the consultation papers?
Well, before I answer that question, I think you actually raised a really good point that I wanted to pick up on with about the testing side of things. When operational resilience, at the time we called it stress testing, when it came out of the original discussion paper, everyone said, yeah, this is a fantastic idea. And the model at the time that was being used was like financial stability stress testing. Now, of course, failing a financial stability test is actually a terrible outcome. There are all manner of consequences to firms and banks if they fail those particular tests with respect to capital and otherwise. Getting firms and markets into a frame of mind where actually you want to test this stuff until breakage and then make that information known in a useful way is going to require a total change of mindset for many people, particularly at the C-suite level. Look, to go back to your original question, do we think do I think that the proposals are going to change markedly from what we saw in the CP in December? I think the answer there is no. Dating all the way back to the DP and even before that, the authorities have been quite clear that their direction of travel, at least the thematic concepts underpinning the proposals, important business services, scenario testing, et cetera, they're quite comfortable that they've really hit the sweet spot there and they know what they're talking about. And to be fair, many in the market agree with this as well. UK finances will be imminently filing our consultation response to the authorities. I think tomorrow actually is the due date where it comes due. And generally speaking, people are on board with many of the concepts. Where there remains area for, I suppose, amendment or further clarification, it's around things like the definition of important business services and what's in and what's out, how impact tolerances are going to function in practice, what good scenario testing looks like. But I think for all your listeners out there today and people who are watching this, if you're not already aware of the concepts underpinning the CP and the DP, if you haven't had that conversation with your board as a board about what our important business services are, then actually I would get on it fairly post-haste. We're expecting the policy statements to come out early next year, Q1, Q2, probably COVID depending if we're being honest. And then the timelines inherent to the CP about implementation are very aggressive. 12 months from the publication of the of the policy statement, the authorities expect firms to be well on their way to understanding and adhering to the policy. 3 years after that, 2 years after that, they're going to start coming down a bit heavier on people. So I think their view is that, keep in mind these CPs were originally due in April, that we've given everyone an extra 6 months to think about this. And thanks to COVID, everyone's had an opportunity to do this in real life. Okay, but it's time to get on and go.
Yeah, and I think that's the extra 6 months I think is noted, and I think the interesting thing will be if they expect firms to have carried on working while on their operational resilience preparations while effectively the response to the consultation papers was delayed. I would imagine the answer to that is yes, particularly in light of what caused the delay. I'd just like to go back quickly to the scenario testing piece. And Mark, how would you see firms go about creating the scenarios to use?
Yeah, great question, Will, because if you talk to firms about scenario planning and scenario testing, nobody is going to tell you that they don't do it. Everybody says that they do. But what they're doing is very often not an effective process. At Mind Alpha, we use the Oxford scenario planning approach, which is born out of work done or initiated by Shell in the 1970s, and it's a method that's been tried and tested and proven over decades. Generally speaking, when people think about scenarios, what they're actually describing is one of two things. It's either an alternative base case scenario. So they've got their view of the world and they're saying, well, if I'm wrong, then the next most likely outcome is plan B. Or they're talking right at the sort of tails of the distribution of events. They're talking about these sort of crazy outlying events. They're trying to forecast the unpredictable, the unforecastable. With scenario planning, the key is actually to be in between those. What we're looking for is not trying to forecast the probability of a series of possible outcomes, but to identify impactful, disruptive, or transformative sequences of events or outcomes that are plausible. And that's the key. It's about plausibility, not about probability. So what you need to do in an effective scenario planning process is to think about all the factors that can have an impact on your business. And the methodology that we use starts looking at the macro context, the sort of contextual environment, all of the different macro factors that impact not just your business, but everybody that touches your business at any point. So it could be your customers, it could be your supply chains, it could be your employees, it could be your employees' families. Doesn't matter, but anybody that has the capacity to influence the behavior of people that touch your business at any point. So you kind of examine all those different factors, you look at how people in that transactional environment are going to react to those. And you really have to get into that from different perspectives. Somebody in the scenario planning space once said, if you expect people to do what's in your best interest, you're probably going to misunderstand their likely course of behavior. Once you've mapped all that out, the key to it is to really then identify which are the most uncertain of those factors and which are the most impactful. If you've got factors that are fairly kind of predictable, fairly certain, you can see where they're going. They don't fit into scenario testing. They fit in your day-to-day strategy and analysis. They fit into the models that you use every day. So what you want are things that are uncertain, but would have a huge impact or transformational impact on your business. And so the process is designed to get away from probability and think about disruptive plausibility. And I guess to sort of sum them up, there are sort of 5 golden rules of creating really effective scenarios. The first is there's always more than one answer. If you get into a scenario planning process, you're trying to build some scenarios up and you go, oh, okay, we've got it. Plan A, we were wrong, we saw the world wrong, and now we found the right answer. Those are not scenarios. What you're trying to do with scenarios is to generate possible unexpected outcomes to expected events. So more than one answer. The second is that they've got to be impactful and relevant to the business, but they must also be plausible. So again, I'm using this word, and it's really important. The third is that you should never assign probabilities to them, because if you get into that discussion about the most likely event or the next most likely event after plan A, you get tied into that set of assumptions and judgments that you made when you were outlining your original business plan. You want to get into those events that are further down that probability spectrum, the things that people say, well, they're probably not going to happen. And instead of discarding them, well, we're not going to vote to leave the European Union. People are not going to vote Donald Trump in. These sort of things. You're saying, well, they are plausible. What would it mean for my business if this was to play out? The fourth one is really around kind of behavioral norms, avoiding groupthink. The biggest problem you see with scenario building is you get a group of people that come together and the conversation's dominated by one or two individuals. The greatest asset to building scenarios is cognitive diversity. It's breadth and depth of information from all of the people in your team, in your organization, and around it you have access to, and making sure that those get heard. And then the final one goes back to what I said about responses to a crisis. It's that same old thing. Don't let perfect be the enemy of very good. Scenarios like disaster responses should evolve. And I just wanted to touch on one of the questions, actually. The question was, what timelines assume performing comprehensive scenario testing and self-assessment? And now I assume the question is specific more to the regulatory requirements around that and the timeframes people expect to see that done in. But from a scenario planner's perspective, you shouldn't think in the context of a timeline. You should be thinking in context of impact. So are these plausible events impactful or not? Because the attraction of scenario planning is it doesn't matter whether the scenario plays out tomorrow or next month or next year. It's that you've thought through the patterns that emerge. You've thought about what these disruptive scenarios might look like. And so that's the key part. They evolve all the time. As you get new data coming in, you will kind of continue to evolve and grow these scenarios. And it speaks to Rogan's point about continuity. You create scenarios in a way that as people leave an organization, new people coming in are familiar with them. They understand the stories.
Mark, that's a very useful run through and some pointers. And given how much weight the boards are going to have to give to their scenario testing when it comes to signing off that their firms are resilient, but actually creating those scenarios and crafting them in the right way, I think is going to be absolutely key. So we're going to move on to the Q&A phase here, and we've had a few questions come in. That we're not going to go through all of them, but we're going to pick a selection. So Lucinda, what is the capacity, human and financial, required for the whole operational resilience cycle?
This is an interesting question, and the answer is it depends, right? So, no two financial services firms are the same. The effort that a firm's going to have to expend is going to vary on a couple of number of factors. One, the size of the company, how many different services do they offer? How many different locations do they operate in? How robust are their technology platforms? How good are their teams, and how good is their documentation of how their current business processes are strung together? We've seen conversations with some of our firms, the larger tier 1 banks, who are well on their way in terms of running pilots on this, where they've expended about 3 months worth of time identifying 2 pilot important business services and taking that through the scenario testing and sharing that back to their board as a offering in terms of getting the funding to progress into the full phase of the program. Realistically speaking, I think your big tier 1 firms are going to spend quite a chunk of time and effort on this. There's poor documentation in most cases, and the new elements that are brought forward from this regulation around identifying business services from the perspective of a customer is very different. The impact tolerances is something new that they haven't done before. And the scenario testing is going to have a different lens on it, as Mark and Rogan both alluded to. So I think it's going to take the larger firms the better part of the next sort of 15 months to 2 years to get ready for it. And that will involve hundreds of their team members to execute the analysis through the scenario testing. And then you could see years worth of work to resolve any of the vulnerabilities, depending on how significant they are.
And I think that's the amount of effort required to remediate vulnerabilities is going to be a shock to some. Once you define what your impact tolerance is in terms of harm to customers, it's very difficult then to try to sidestep it and saying that, but we're not actually then going to spend the money to make the processes behind our services resilient enough to meet that. So another question, Rogan, this is a good one. How are dual regulated firms going to manage the different impact tolerances? Does it create duplication?
That is the $64 million question, or $64,000 question, as the case may be. So this is one of the areas where we as a sector are calling for greater clarification. And there's two parts to this, actually. There's not only different impact tolerances for the same business line, depending on the level of harm it might cause one or multiple customer groups. There's also how large international firms will deal with applying impact tolerances to important business services if they have a global footprint. Good examples: the JPs, the Goldmans, the City of the World. They have operations in a whole range of jurisdictions, both within the UK and without. So you might be an investment bank. You might have your sales and trading operation here. You might have your client-facing operations in Luxembourg in terms of your sales. You might have your clearing operations in Germany into Clearstream or otherwise. You might have your prudential, prudential controls exercised in another part of the world. So how do all those parts fit together? How do all the jigsaws fit together? Part of this will be hopefully made clear, or at least assisted by the consultation that's going on at the Basel committee level, which is due in early November, which hopefully will create at least a cogent framework for other jurisdictions to work in. But to get to the specifics of your question in terms of managing different impact tolerances, there is one strain of thought that ultimately it comes down to lowest common denominator. If I understand that I'm a retail firm, and if I understand that my customers, I have one segment of customers that can live without a particular service for 24 hours, but I have another segment of customers who use that same service and they can only live on for 6 hours. Do I take the 6 hours? Is it the lowest common denominator, the position that I take? As our thinking in this has evolved, actually much of it comes to proportionality, and understanding that, okay, how critical is the service that I provide to a particular customer, and if it is different from another, if firm A relies on me for 80% of the business, but firm B only relies on me for 20% of the business, well, am I actually, is an outage in this area going to occur as firm B, inherent intolerable harm compared to harm? Is it disproportionate? What's the proportionate? Probably go down with path A. So there's a range of thinking there as well. I know Capco has done some thinking on this. I know I've borne witness to some of you guys thinking on this as well. So I'd certainly encourage that actually, firms, as they try and grapple with this different impact tolerances for the same sector, it does to me come back to a couple of things. Really understanding your customer. Okay, really understanding what an outage in a particular segment would do to that customer, and then making a judgment on proportionality. The second is really understanding your own business, okay, and understanding where the key points of contact with your clients are. What's the difference between an important business service and a point of contact? The third is drawing on the experience of firms like Capco and other advisors to really understand what else the industry is doing out there, so we can come with a broadly cogent approach to this across the sector.
Rogan, thank you for that. I think those are very sage points for firms to consider. And yeah, we hope it is defined better when the response to the consultation papers is announced. With that, I'd like to hand back to James.
Thank you, Will. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to Mark from Mind Alpha, and thank you to Rogan from UK Finance. Capco will be working with UK Finance and publishing a podcast in the very near future. Please look out for that. And also we'll be having further papers and announcements on ops resilience in the next quarter. Please look out for them. Our next webinar series is going to be on supercharging data strategy insurance on October the 6th. Recordings for all our webinars and all our papers are found on our website, capco.com. I thank you. A good day. We will be following up, and you'll have these materials in your inbox by the end of the week. Have a great day. Thank you.